Dr. Carolyn West is Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Washington, where she teaches courses on human sexuality, sexual deviance, sex crimes, and sexual violence. Dr. West has been a sex educator for more than 30 years and has written extensively on racism in sexualized media. In 2018, she produced the documentary, Let Me Tell You About Black Chicks, Images of Black Women in Pornography. Dr. West trains, consults, and speaks to national and international audiences. She's worked as an expert witness in domestic violence, sexual assault cases, delivered keynote addresses, conducted workshops, and created innovative training materials to educate and equip professionals with the skills to provide culturally sensitive services to survivors of colour. You can see Carolyn's full bibliography, Carolyn's full bio on our site. And I'd just like to say that Carolyn and I have worked together for quite a number of years. I think that we've really attempted to bring in an analysis of race, and you were the leader in this, Carolyn, is really speaking about the importance of understanding how racism functions in pornography. So welcome to our conference. Thank you for being willing to speak, and we're really looking forward to this.
Thank you so much. All the speakers have been amazing, and I really appreciate your time and attention and ability to speak with you. Well, this morning, it's about 8 o'clock here in the Pacific Northwest. So what I'd like to talk about in the time that I have with you is how do we do sex education through an anti-racist and anti-porn lens? I think as my research grows in this area, I'm becoming much more aware of how important this topic is. I'm including my contact information, and I'll also make additional information available after this presentation. So I'm a faculty member at the University of Washington. And so been a sex educator for probably about 30 years now. And there's no area of research that I have done that has disturbed me in the way that this body of research has. So I think where we need to start is to have a really critical conversation about why racism in porn, and maybe why nobody is even talking about this topic. And so I try to get rid of some of the more graphic images, but obviously talking about racism and then also sexualized images or porn can be challenging. So want to make people aware of just a trigger warning in some of the images that we'll be seeing in the time that I will be spending with you. But what it seems to me is that we are living through an interesting time in history, in that we are starting to challenge the images that we've lived with just for hundreds of years and that we've been surrounded by and seem to be very normalized. So just this year, these images are called the Plantation Trio. Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, the cream of wheat, a cook, chef that's on the cream of wheat box. All these images go back and are deeply rooted in our enslaved past. And as we've started to understand, and even manufacturers are understanding, well, maybe these images don't reflect where we are now in our culture, and they need to be challenged and changed. And so the Aunt Jemima image has been removed from the pancake box. They're also redoing the Uncle Ben's image, the cream of wheat image. We're even challenging historical films like Gone with the Wind and why some of those representations are problematic. The Disney film, The Song of the South, some of those images are problematic. And so there's almost been this cancel culture with the recognition we can't continue to kind of promote these images, particularly of African Americans that are deeply enrooted in slavery and are just simply offensive. And so what's interesting, though, is the porn industry all of a sudden decided that, well, maybe we need to look at some of our racist images as well. And Adult Video News actually said in one of their publications, well, we need to do better. We need to understand that the images that we're promoting in pornography are racist, offensive, and as an industry, we can no longer deny that these films simply, they amplify racism and discrimination. And so we'll see that they were quite right, but they certainly were willing to profit from this and continue to be willing to profit from it. So they have a real nice statement, as many other businesses do, to argue we are going to do better in this regard in terms of addressing racism. And even Pornhub sent out a tweet saying, we stand in solidarity against racism and we're for social justice. And we encourage you to give to organizations like the NAACP and these other organizations that promote civil rights and civil justice. But I loved it when Fight the New Drug pushed back and say, well, no, you don't. No, you simply don't. You can't stand for anti-racism when you have videos on your site with titles that they just listed that are horrifically racist. Clearly, you were not on the side of social justice, which prompted me to write an opinion piece for Newsweek. And I'll be sure to share that with any participants who would like to take a look at it. That racism in pornography is rife, and we can't talk about moving towards social justice without addressing the racism in this form of media, which is really a form of violence against women. So I had the pleasure with Dr. Dines in writing this piece for Slate, co-authoring this piece, where we realized that actually pornography sexualizes everything, violence and social justice movements. I mean, when COVID happened, we're still living through COVID, then there was COVID porn. They find a way to sexualize just everything. And the same thing happened with the Black Lives Matter movement and other social movements. Instead of taking it seriously, what they've done is they found ways to sexualize that and then further dehumanize people of color. And so we unpacked that in this op-ed that appeared in Slate, how the Pornhub sort of hijacked the Black Lives Matter movement and created just a whole nother genre of pornography as a result of that. And so I've been concerned about this topic for some time. When I realized that the Pornhub, they collect statistics about everything. And the numbers of viewers on porn sites is just dramatic. Millions of viewers every day, billions of viewers over the a year of time. And one genre of video focuses on race and racism. If you type in ebony or black or various iterations of the N-word, you'll come up with more than 22,000 videos. And after some critique and criticism, Pornhub has removed some of those videos, but they're still very much on their website. And if you type in other ethnic populations, similarly, you will also see around Asian, around Latino, all these videos featuring race that feature racist content. So I started to do this work and I just could not stop asking myself, what does this do to your mental health when you're consuming these types of images? What does it do to your sense of masculinity? How does it really shape how you see Black women? And so that really started to prompt me to work on a documentary, which I've been screening internationally, called Let Me Tell Y'all About Black Chicks, Images of Black Women in Pornography. And some of that can be found, the trailer and some additional information about that can be found on my website at drcarolynwest.com. But as I said, this has been some of the most difficult work that I have done. And I just a jaw-dropping amount of racism that would not exist in mainstream media to this extent. So I think it's, first of all, so I want to talk to you about what that looks like in pornography and how that happens in pornography, I think is because there's no filter. So they feel very comfortable just saying or producing content that would never be acceptable in mainstream media. So pornography is just filled with racist stereotypes and images of all racial groups, and particularly African Americans. So it's very common to see titles like Ghetto Freak or Inner City Sluts or Ghetto Hood Rats or Urban Hoochies. So they really link this to African Americans being economically disadvantaged, urban dwellers, violent, criminalized. So those stereotypes are very prominent in mainstream porn today. Black women are oftentimes reduced to prostitutes and sex workers more than any other racial group. So there tends to be this link there. And I talk about that more in my work on sex trafficking and Black girls, because we can't continue to have that conversation without also thinking about how sex trafficking is linked to pornography. So I think that's really critical, because in pornography, that they almost act like the natural state for Black women is to be prostitutes or really prostituted, and that this is acceptable and normalized. So you'll see titles like Black Girls Working the Streets and Black Street Hookers. They had 107 versions of the porn series Black Street Hookers. So they had been producing the same title for 17 years. You don't do that unless 16 years of that title have sold pretty well. So it's deeply embedded in the history, and they continue to make these movies relentlessly. So you'll see things like Parking Lot Pimp. So Black women are associated with prostitution much more than other racial groups tend to be. We'll see in pornography that exploitation is really normalized. I mean, they don't even try to sanitize this or clean this up. You'll see titles such as Pimp My Black Teen. You're just calling it what it is. And so that is a film series where they take young women and then they give them sort of like a makeover with makeup and everything. And so it's sort of pimping as implying that it's improving their situation when in fact it's not. And you'll see titles such as Exploited Black Teens. They're really clear. It's not sanitized or cleaned up in any way. This kind of sexual violence and sexual exploitation is quite normalized in pornography. So targeting a vulnerable population in that way is deeply distressing to me. And so another thing you'll see in terms of racism in pornography is that, Black women's bodies, every part of their bodies are just degraded, from hair texture to weight, to skin color. And so they'll really play that up in porn videos. So those are some of the ways that racism gets played out differently. So it's horrible for women of all ethnic backgrounds, but when you add race on top of that, it just amplifies, pornography amplifies that racism quite dramatically. So I'm also, as I turn my research to looking at how pornography also deals with African American men, I'm finding equally as distressing images of them as well. So I've been writing about that more, did a piece for Fight the New Drug in July for to really kind of turn our attention there, because I think we aren't having that conversation either. And one part of that article that really jumped out for me when I was writing, the porn industry doesn't even try to disguise their racism. You know, they'll use the terms that harken back to the antebellum or slavery period of calling Black men mandingos, bucks, black beasts. And it's deeply rooted in this history of depicting Black men as sexual predators. And as we live during a time when we're thinking more about police brutality, for example, against African American men, I wonder what porn does when it amplifies this message that Black men are sexual predators. And I want to give you some examples of how deeply offensive pornography is around this topic with Black men. If you just read some of the descriptions of this, the racist descriptions of videos featuring Black men, and they will just openly write things like, remember when your kid and your mom used to, when you were a kid, your mom used to take you to the zoo. And it talks, it's so dehumanizing that, you know, not even sure like where you go with that. The animals always so scared you, but you felt safe and protected. But could you imagine coming home to find your mom being ravaged by a Negro? This time, good friends, the animals are not in cages, but in your beloved mother. She can't protect you now. Mourn her loss and move on. So the dehumanization is really striking to me with descriptions like that. And there was a whole genre of this. This was a popular series some time ago, and it was, oh no, there's a Negro in my mom. And another example of that is, you knew this day would come. White people, no amount of jails or loan denials could prevent it. You knew the Negroes were coming into the suburbs, but you just never thought they would invade your home and your mom. So sit back and watch as everything you knew as pure and beautiful is destroyed. So this kind of notion, there's so much there to unpack. You know, it would take me quite a bit of time to do that, but they definitely draw on historical tropes about Black people being dangerous or moving into your neighborhood and will become sexual predators. And that just shapes, I'll talk about implicit biases here in shortly, but it's as in porn, they can say all the things that racists want to say publicly. And this becomes a setting where they can say it, and then it's couched in humor, so it's not taken seriously. So the whole thing is hugely problematic. And what I'm a researcher at heart, and so what does the research tell us? That's where I base my findings on this. And a growing body of research is showing us, and this article came out recently in 2020, that Black women are often in pornography, they did a content analysis, and they found that looking at images across different racial groups, Black women are more often the targets of aggression, physical aggression. Gail talked about that in her opening keynote about the aggression in pornography. But then when you add race to that, Black women are oftentimes more targeted for that physical aggression, punching, slapping, kicking, verbal abuse, even more than white women are. And Black men are more often portrayed as perpetrators of aggression against women and are shown being less intimate with their partners. So that really sets people up when they consume this body of material about who they think Black people are. And it also shapes the template for young people who are viewing this as well. So I want to also talk about some of the impact of this, the psychological impact of this on young people and what we need to do around sex education around this, because one study actually looked, and I thought the title was just very striking. Without porn, I wouldn't know all the things that I know. And they surveyed young people who had consumed pornography, kids between the ages of 16 and 18, young people who were Black and Hispanic. And what they found is that they weren't just watching porn, but they were also watching extremely violent porn that involved humiliation and incest and all forms of violence against women. And the researcher asked them why they were watching this, and they were watching for entertainment, for stimulation, what was disturbing to me as a sex educator, for instructional purposes. They were getting their cues about how they should be sexual and learn about sex from pornography. They were copying the behavior in pornography during their sexual encounters. And so filming their partners without their consent, a strangulation, doing what they were seeing in pornography, mimicking that behavior. And many of the young women said they felt pressure to actually making pornography and filming themselves in these very violent, unhealthy dating relationships. So we're also finding that exposure to pornography has been linked to reproductive health issues and problems. So in this particular study, they found that about a third of the young Black teen girls in this study had been exposed to X-rated movies or pornography. And that was associated with negative attitudes toward condoms, having multiple sex partners, more frequent intercourse, less contraceptive use, desire for pregnancy to become pregnant, testing positive for sexually transmitted infections like chlamydia, and being exposed or being a victim of dating violence. So we can't say, it's too simplistic to say pornography causes this. This was a correlational study. But what seems to be implying here that those things are linked, and we need to understand how pornography sets the stage for that. So they think about, as we do this work and as we go forward, whatever we do, it's got to be, if we're going to do sex education, it's always got to be through an anti-racist and an anti-porn lens. And that's going to be critical for whatever racial group that you work with. It's got to be anti-racist and it's got to be anti-porn. And I think part of how we do that is that we need to challenge implicit biases, those kinds of assumptions, stereotypes, prejudices, unintentional though they may sometimes be, that we have about all racial groups, religious or gender, sexual orientation or ability, those embedded beliefs that we have that are stored in our unconscious that causes us to act in ways that are biased and hurtful toward other people. So understanding where they come from, and I think part of that is understanding many of these images that we're surrounded by come from pornography in our pornified culture. So challenging that within ourselves is one way to begin. The second thing we have to do is we've got to get more interested in the images that are in pornography. We can't continue to sort of pretend like, oh, it's bad for everybody. So talking about race and racism is exceedingly uncomfortable. So oftentimes I think as scholars and sex educators, we tend to avoid that because it's just a very difficult conversation to have. So we can't continue to do that. We have to talk about the racism in porn as well as the violence that's in porn, because those things are linked and need to be addressed simultaneously. So I've been providing, doing as much information writing as I can on racism in porn. I've done a couple of short pieces for Fight the New Drug, and I think those are going to be available to you in chat and will be available after this presentation is over. I think we have to start early when we do porn education and to teach our kids about how to avoid pornography and the impact that it has. We've got another reason to have this conversation is also talking about the racism in pornography. So have been trying to write more about that, how to have that conversation, how parents can have that conversation with young children. We have to take a historical view. We can't continue to be sort of ahistoric about this. So, and what do I mean by that? The images that we see in pornography didn't come out of nowhere. It's not like pornography created these images. They draw on hundreds and hundreds of years of these images being around and used to justify sexual violence and physical violence against communities of color. So in other words, for hundreds of years, African-American women were sexually assaulted, and it was not illegal to do that. Porn just amplifies those tropes and those beliefs about who Black women are, and then they create videos like Black Girls Just Don't Say No. And then all of these images permeate our entire culture. So then when you have what happened at the Super Bowl many years ago with Janet Jackson, people just act like, well, it's her fault, or this is not really a form of sexual violence, and that she's the cause for it. So we've got to understand how it's deeply rooted in history, how these images permeate the entire society, and they get amplified in pornography. So understanding important links there as we do any kind of sex education, so that those things don't seem to be so normalized and so acceptable. We've got to look at the adultification and sexualization of Black girls. So there have been a couple of studies on this, Girlhood Interrupted, and what they did is they asked adults their perceptions of Black girls, and these were adults said they perceive Black girls as less nurturing, needing less protection, needing to be supported less, needing to be comforted less, more independent, knowing more about adult topics, knowing more about sex. And so they're sexualized so early in life that, and so much of that also is linked to the consumption of pornography. So we need to get more educated about the adultification and sexualization of Black girls and Black women throughout their lives, because it certainly makes it easier for perpetrators like the recently convicted R. Kelly, for example, who was able to make pornography with young Black girls in Chicago and across the country, and people knew and didn't step in or do anything about that. So that kind of education is critical. We have to understand how the lack of sex education And access to porn actually ends up pushing girls out of schools and criminalizing them. Because what happens, I'm finding with my research with men who consume, who purchase sex, who are actually prostituting people and buying sex from women who are being prostituted, they're also heavy porn consumers. And they're also targeting young girls of color, which means that they end up being forced out or dropping out of the school system. So how does all of that relate? Some of the young girls that I talk to who are being prostituted and trafficking or being trafficked are also making porn themselves, or they understand that the men who are trafficking them are using porn. So how are all of those things related that it's disrupting their education in some pretty profound ways? We've got to stop thinking about sex education as something that happens in school settings. And we need to go to communities where marginalized populations are and doing that work there. We've got to go to them and do sex education that's anti-racist and through anti-porn lens in their communities, because they're oftentimes living in these very coercive sexual environments where pornography, they're around people who are consuming pornography, and that's part of that sexual coercion, and having conversations there. We need to work with young people of color to make sure that they are media literate and that they understand the images that they're seeing, and more importantly, to help them to produce images that's more reflective of who they are and that's more empowering. So doing that media literacy so that porn doesn't become the source of education for them. We need to make sure that we're not overlooking sexual minorities, kids who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, transgender, because oftentimes for them, the only sex education that they have access to or easy access to is pornography. And this study came out it was 2015, and they were finding that young Black men who were same-sex attracted, they got much of their sex education from pornography. They got their sexual scripts from the porn, how it should feel, what they should do, how they should behave. And so it was actually a form of sex education because there was almost nothing else for them. So we need to make sure that those populations and those groups who are even more marginalized have comprehensive, medically accurate sex education in a way that's not shaming of who they are. We also have to do a better job of developing models for healthy sexual behavior. If we can't just tell kids what not to do or to shame them for their sexuality, we have to help them develop, well, what is a healthy sexuality? If we don't want you to do this, then what does a healthy, happy sexuality look like for you? And then how do you create that separate from a pornified world? Because what ends up happening is you turn on the Grammy Awards and you see Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B performing on a large bed and dancing around a stripper pole. And then we tell people that this is what is sexual empowerment. But if kids don't have another way of adults in their lives telling them something different from what the porn industry is telling them, then they have no other model. So how do we create what a healthy sexuality looks like them in the context of racism and sexism in this culture? And I'll end here and then take some questions. I think at the end of the day, why we all need to care about this is because I always think of a quote by James Baldwin that, for these are all of our children, and we shall profit from or pay for whatever they become. So we need to all be invested in this, regardless of what perspective we're approaching this from.